Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to episode 2 of the Genesis. My name is Blake Isbill, and today we are going to be talking about the book of Nehemiah. So, on this podcast, we end up talking about how just books of the Bible and stories from them, and I try to cover some that I don't think get covered as much as maybe they should, or just are not as popular as some. So, last week we did Ezra. The reason we did Ezra is because it covers how after the big exile, the people were able to return to Jerusalem. And you need the context of Ezra to be able to really kind of understand Nehemiah. So if you didn't hear the first one, I guess you can go back, but I'll try my best to explain it a bit further. All right, so starting in chapter 1, we get introduced to Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, we believe that he wrote this book, but it might have been Ezra. But if Ezra did write this book, then it's from the point of view from Nehemiah. So no matter what, Nehemiah is the one telling this story. It takes about 13 years. It takes place about 13 years after the book of Ezra. And so something interesting to note is that Nehemiah was a cupbearer. And a cupbearer is like a pretty high up ranking government job where he makes sure the food and drink for the king are safe to consume. Now, I wouldn't want to have to do that because I wouldn't want to have to, try stuff and make sure it's not going to hurt him. But it was something that was pretty important. So, Nehemiah ends up wondering because he had been hearing about how Ezra and Zerubbabel, the two groups from the book of Ezra, had gone over and were rebuilding Jerusalem, and he said, "Hey, how's it going over there?" And he heard that the walls and all that were still in ruin. Now, this was a big deal to Nehemiah and really just grieved him deeply. And it was because he didn't want Jerusalem to be open to those kind of elements. The enemies were constantly attacking them. And so his thought, his idea immediately went to, oh no, the enemies will be able to attack if there's not any sort of defense. So he prays this great prayer. He asks God to open his ears and be attentive to the prayer, and a prayer that acknowledges divinity in God, repentance, and a plea to return him so that he may be able to help. So then in chapter 2, King Artaxerxes, he's from Ezra, he sees that Nehemiah is pretty upset. And he sees that it's not like some sort of sickness, but he can tell that it's some sort of, emotional sickness. And Nehemiah explains, and this is direct quote, "The city, the place of my fathers' tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire." He's saying, why shouldn't he be upset because of that? And I think that's kind of incredible. I think Nehemiah is a great book because it's easy to follow God when it's not going to get you in trouble. It's easy to do it when, there's no stakes. But Nehemiah, he kind of takes a bunch of risk. He questions authority. He says stuff pretty bluntly to people about this because he feels just so deeply about it. So Nehemiah asks the king if it pleases him to send him back to Jerusalem so he can, make it good again. And surprisingly, King Artaxerxes says yes. So here's the request that Nehemiah has. He asks that letters be given to the governors. And it's basically it's kind of like a passport almost. It's basically saying, yeah, you're cool to, go here. You're not going to get in trouble for going over here. And then a letter for Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. Now what that means is, since Nehemiah is planning on rebuilding these walls, he needs materials. He needs mats. So he's going to get a bunch of this wood and stuff. And there's another verse 8 says, "The good hand of my God was on me." We see this a lot in the book of Nehemiah, how he asks for these things, and it's you see him and you kind of think, wow, Nehemiah, he's being brave, he's negotiating, but a lot of it would not have gone down if he didn't have the hand of God on him, because he is asking some pretty big things. So then we run into the main enemies of this story. There's 3, but first we run into these 2. Sanballat, that's an interesting name, and then Tobiah. And they were both officials, and they did not like the idea that he was going to try to do this. I think they saw it as a threat to authority. They probably thought that he was going to try to undermine them, but mainly it was just he's not doing exactly what we say. So Nehemiah goes, and with just a few people and just like the animal he rode on, and he went at night so no one would see him, and he inspects, and he sees how bad, how awful the ruins are, how it's like it's not even recognizable anymore. I think there's something to be noted here. It's interesting how this group of people, so Nehemiah gets just a few people, not many, they almost seem a bit more, I don't know, excited. Sometimes with these groups, they almost seem to be doing it begrudgingly. They know they need to, but it's kind of scary. I think Nehemiah almost has this like yes, like go get itness about him. And that's pretty impressive in these harsh circumstances. But then the enemies show up, those two from before, and then a new one, Geshem, show up and mock and despise them, saying like, what are you even doing? Like, you're rebelling against the king, and we don't like you doing this. And Nehemiah responds in Nehemiah 2:20. He said, so I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. He's basically saying, get out of my way. I'm going to do this whether you like it or not, which is pretty great. Chapter 3 just talks about the details of the walls that are built around Jerusalem. And then when we go to chapter 4, work is ridiculed. So when Sanballat heard about this, he began to mock them. What are the feeble Jews doing? He says that. Can they finish it in a day? He's being pretty bad. Like, they were really not big fans of these guys. And then Tobiah comes up and starts making fun of the walls. Imagine if you were building something, you like, this is your passion project, and people are coming up saying, look at you, like, you stink at this. And then Tobiah comes up and said, if a fox should jump on it, he should break their stone wall down. These guys are pretty awful towards them. The people who were opposed to this were not just only like haters, they weren't just emotionally bad, but they were physically a threat to Nehemiah and his people. They wanted them dead. They weren't just doing this to be rude. And so he asked God to listen to what they were saying, what the enemies are saying, and deliver punishment onto them. Because these comments had actually gotten through to some of the people there, and it was honestly bringing the mood down. It was making some of them distressed that they were hearing this. And so the enemies began to conspire, trying to come up with a plan that would be able to like throw a wrench into the building plan of the Jews. So then as we go on, they had to end up setting up guards around to be able to, guard the wall, because there was a true threat, a true sense of danger that this could happen. And they prayed, saying how they felt like they couldn't build the walls. And the enemy's plan was to infiltrate them from the inside, making spies to go in, and they would to kill them and stop their work. But it's interesting to note that the best attack that any of the enemies ever do is when they're attacking from the inside. It's easy to avoid an attack when you see it coming. It is much harder when it is coming from the people you trust. And we'll see that as we go through Nehemiah. You'll see people that Nehemiah trusts. You'll see how they plan to harm him and how sometimes it's successful. So to prepare, going back on track, Nehemiah sets up people to guard the lowest points of the wall and also the parts that aren't like covered up yet. And Nehemiah, great motivational speaker, by the way, he reminds them to not be afraid and to remember they were fighting for not only God, but for their families. Nehemiah, the motivator over here. And so now they kind of had to change it up. So at first, there's not a ton of people building, honestly. I mean, there's a decent bit, but, it's not as much as you might think. But now they gotta have to change it up. The building process changes. Nehemiah had to make it so that half would build and the other half would guard. And the builders of the walls would have tools in one hand and a weapon in the other. they were constantly on guard. Like, this isn't some deal where it's like every once in a while these enemies were coming up. It was constant. The trumpeter stood near Nehemiah awaiting a signal so that if enemies would come, he would blow the trumpet and they would know to fight. And Nehemiah told them, "Our God will fight for us." So they were not running, they were going to fight. They stood their guard at all times, and that even when they were bathing, they would bring their weapons into the water. So then, in chapter 5, we get this thing called usury. Okay, I never heard of this term. But usury is the illegal action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest. All right, so while the process of building the walls was going on, Nehemiah's people ended up needing food and stuff, of course. But they were kind of preoccupied with the whole building process, so they were having to buy food and stuff. But when they couldn't afford it, they had to borrow money. And these brethren who were lending the money ended up just taxing like super hardcore, so much so that even some of these parents to even feed their kids would then have to put their kids to slavery because these taxes that were being imposed were so harsh. And there are times in the Bible, Leviticus 35:26, do not take usurious interest from him. And it's basically talking about how it talks about it multiple times, how you're not supposed to do these unreasonable taxes. It talks about forgiving your brother's debt, all that kind of stuff. So this was not a God-imposed idea for the people to be just, tax. That was not the plan. And then if you look at this, you can even go to 1 Timothy 6:10, and it says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." We often think money is the root of all evil. We say that a lot, but it's actually the love of money is the root of all evil, is what it says in the Bible. And you can see here, they were doing pretty good. They were being protected from the enemies, even though, they had to be on guard a lot. God was protecting them. But whenever they start doing this, that's when they start allowing evil to get in. The love of money, the love of greed, all of this, that's when stuff starts going awry. So it's obvious that, this greed is what's causing their hardships now. And so after hearing this, Nehemiah wasn't a kind of guy who would just, say, "Oh, strike one." He criticized them for not walking in the fear of God. And when we say the fear of God, we don't mean like, "Oh no, like God's coming after me, I'm scared." It's more of like a respect. And he pleaded with them to put an end to what they were doing and to give back the land and vineyards. And so, how did they respond? What does everyone think? Because when I was first reading, I was thinking they're probably going to make some excuse. Verse 12 says, "We will give it back and will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say." They did it. Like, they listened. So Nehemiah gave them kind of a demonstration, actually. He took off his garment, like his robe or whatever, and he just shook it. He shook the dust off of it, and he said, "This is what God's going to do to you if you don't do what's right. He's going to shake you out of his garment." And so Nehemiah was honestly kind of sassed them a little bit, but, it seemed like they really needed it. And so this went pretty well with the people because Nehemiah actually got elected as governor. And additionally, he even chose not to accept the salary out of respect for God. And Nehemiah asked God to remember him for the good that he has done. So that ends off chapter 5. And after the short commercial break, we'll be right back to finish off Nehemiah. Hello and welcome back, everybody, to the Genesis. We are still covering Nehemiah. We are going to start chapter 6 now. So the enemy's plot, that's what this is called. And now Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, those are all the enemies, heard about how Nehemiah was rebuilding all the walls. And they had completed everything except for the doors being set up. They invited him to come and meet up. All right. I want to pose a question to everybody. If someone who has been trying to kill you for like a few days now said, "Hey, actually this passion project you're doing is pretty great. Let's meet up and get some coffee. You probably want to meet him. And that's what Nehemiah, he kind of saw right through this. What they were trying to do is they were trying to get him out there so they could hurt him. And they sent messages like this 4 times, and he responded the same way every single time. Then, desperate for their plan to work, Sanballat sent a 5th message that accused Nehemiah and his group of trying to rebel, and that Nehemiah was going to become their king. And basically what he's saying is, hey, you guys are trying to undermine the king's authority, and Nehemiah, he's striving to become the king so that he can, do whatever, do his evil, which is not true, but it was an attempt to get Nehemiah out so that they could, quote unquote, talk things out. Once again, Nehemiah sees right through this and tells Sanballat how he is making this stuff up in his mind. He's basically like, hey, you're not like, this is like a fantasy. You want me to be bad. I'm not doing any of this. Nehemiah knew they were trying to discourage him, but Nehemiah prayed and said, but now, oh God, strengthen my hands. Nehemiah is a praying fellow, and I think that's another thing we can really learn from him. We see these horrible things try to go down. Being hunted, being desired to be killed all the time cannot be good on your mental state. And we see that instead of just breaking down, Nehemiah constantly goes to God. I think that's something that's really important for us. So then they have another plan. So then a man named Shemaiah was speaking to Nehemiah and was encouraging him to hide out in the temple so that he wouldn't be killed. Okay. At first when I read this, I thought, why is that a bad thing? That actually kind of seems smart. Get as close to God as you can, right? In the physical, so that you wouldn't be harmed. Well, the reason that is a bad idea is entering the temple while not being a priest was prohibited. And if Nehemiah had been, he would have been sinning, and it would have given them a quote unquote reason to be able to do harm onto him. It was said in the law that if you're not a priest, you can't go into the temple, or at least unattended. So they were trying to trip him up. And once again, Nehemiah saw this and called it out, revealing to us that Shemaiah was sent to Nehemiah for this purpose. That guy was sent there just to trip Nehemiah up. So now the enemy, we're seeing, like I said earlier, the enemy is now on the inside. Like I said to you, I didn't see that at first. If that guy would have said that to me, I probably would have believed him, because you wouldn't think someone would be able to get on the inside like this. And now at the end of chapter 6, we see that the wall is finished. Now, how long do you guys think it took for them to complete the wall? When I was reading this, I would have figured it had to be a long time. You read and then you realize, like, oh my goodness, like 56 years have passed in the span of 2 chapters. So a lot of time can pass. It took them 52 days. 52 days to go around a country is like nuts for today's time. So it's really insane for that time. So it really is like a testament to, this is like a supernatural amount of time to be able to do this. And the enemies, it actually kind of reversed on them, because now the enemies have lost their confidence seeing the wall completed. But then, we get a little sneak peek into the next chapter, because in verse 19 it says, then Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. So some of the enemies were discouraged, but not all of them, because some of them were pretty persistent. So in chapter 7, we get, they do a census. It's kind of interesting because, you get these like genealogy things, and you get to hear about, the priests and the elders. And usually it's like, well, I don't guess, like there's, I'm not sure what lesson to learn from that. But something interesting chapter 7 says is God put it on Nehemiah's heart to take a census. And I honestly don't know why. I don't really guess I see what great good can come from that. But I think that's kind of just a little lesson to say, like, even these small things, seemingly very small things, are something that God wants us to do. So I don't know. That's just kind of interesting that was put in there, that God asked him to do this. So then, chapter 8, we get a little cameo from someone, Ezra. He's back. So, well, Ezra was there, but now he's back in this book. So Ezra reads the law. So all the people gather and ask Ezra to read them the law of Moses. Not sure if you guys remember, but Ezra is a scribe after all. So, and scribes are like these guys who really just try to understand the law the best they can, the Mosaic law, the law that Moses wrote by God. Yeah. But he read it to them from morning until noon, and all the people listened to him like intently. That's quite a long time. And as he finished, I think this is beautiful. This is a really beautiful passage right here. So as he finished, he blessed God, and all the people raised their hands and they were yelling, "Amen, amen." They were so happy. They were so excited to be able to obey. And I think that's something just like really like, I don't know, that it's just, I don't know. It's really a beautiful thing that there's such joy to be able to obey God, being able to understand something and do it just to please God. I think that's great. And something else interesting, a lot of interesting stuff in here, that's why I chose it, is that it says that Ezra was explaining the law so that it could be understood by all. Sometimes when I read these books of the Bible, I'm not going to say sometimes, almost all the time, there's stuff in there that totally confuses me. And I don't know, it's kind of comforting that there was people even back then who needed to have a bit of extra help on this stuff. So that's interesting. So after this, it was pretty great thing. So the day was kind of considered holy. So people were having like a great feast, big celebration. And it says the people celebrated with a great feast, and because there's a verse, because they understood the words which had been made known to them. They were not sad because they had these new rules. They were happy because they understood them, and that's pretty great. So then we're going to start getting into some more, I don't know, I guess you could call it more traditional stuff. I guess a lot of it's traditional. It is the Old Testament. But it's something called the Feast of Booths. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry. I didn't remember hearing about that until I read this. So the priests continued to have Ezra explain to them the law and all this, and they realized they needed these quote-unquote booths, Booths, for this feast that were spoken of in the law. Now the booths, they're made of leaves. They're like these overhead coverings. When I pulled up pictures, they kind of look like gazebos almost. They're like these like, I don't know, like awnings kind of. And they're these temporary shelters for like worship and stuff. And it says that these had not been done since the days of Joshua. By the way, Joshua might be the next one we do, so stay in tune for that. But Joshua, in between Joshua and Nehemiah, it says that there's about 400 years. So 400 years since this had been done. And so once they were able to do this, there was great rejoicing. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting because I feel like these books don't get talked about very often, Ezra and Nehemiah. But it was obvious that this was kind of a great landmark that they were able to return to a certain point of, I guess, previous glory, that they were doing something that had not been done in so long. So then in chapter 9, this is pretty interesting, the people confessed their sins. So the sons of Israel gathered and confessed both their sins and their father's sins. So what their families before them had done wrong. And they read from the law, the Mosaic law, for 1/4 of the day, and they worshipped and confessed for another 1/4 of the day. So for half the day, they had totally and completely committed it to God. They had this like great prayer that they said, a handful of Levites, which is one of the tribes amongst Jerusalem, or amongst Judah, but the people, a handful of Levites stood on this platform and cried and shouted to God, and they said this prayer. And it kind of reads like a psalm almost. I'm not going to read it because it's pretty long, but it is chapter 9. And it gives thanks for creation, Abraham, Moses, repentance, thanks for compassion and keeping promises and acknowledging their wrongdoing. So it is just kind of, it's almost like thanking God from the beginning up until that point, which is pretty cool that they kind of just hit every major beat, it seems like. So then they made a covenant with God to try and just like keep these statues that they were talking about. And so in chapter 10, we get the names of everyone who signed the document. It's basically everyone there is saying just like, yeah, we're going to keep this up, don't worry. So then in chapter 11, we get a list of the head of provinces. It's just kind of like, it's more just kind of the leaders of these certain factions. And we also get all the list of those around Judah. Then in chapter 12, we get the names of those who returned with Zerubbabel. We get a bunch of names, honestly. And we get kind of just, it's almost a reflection of what's happened so far. These last 2 or 3 chapters just kind of almost wrap up what we've already read. We get procedures for the temple, which talks about, the people singing on top. They kind of had like choirs set up, which is pretty interesting. It's like this wall is not just a wall. It's almost monument to God. So they have these like beautiful things associated with it. And chapter 13, we get some more rules. It talks about not letting the people with the false gods to come in and to allow those to come in. Something interesting, another person who was on the inside doing wrong, Elishib, I believe is how you pronounce it, which was a priest, was related to Tobiah. He was one of the 3 enemies. And I don't even know why he did this. This is messed up. He prepared a room in the temple for Tobiah. And when Nehemiah found out about this, he got pretty upset. And so he got angry and just threw out all of Tobiah's stuff. He evicted him, basically. And he also found out that tithes weren't being given. See, Nehemiah had evidently gone back to King Artaxerxes, and I guess it maybe given him an update, probably. Because earlier, not sure if I mentioned it, but I know he did give the king like a certain amount of time that he was going to try to get it done within. So he went back and told them, and when he came back, they weren't obeying the rules. And he also found out that people were buying and selling on the Sabbath. And he told them to purify themselves and ask God to have compassion on them. And then once again, just like Ezra, while Nehemiah was gone, people, started doing whatever they wanted, and they started marrying outside of the land after promising not to. It's nuts. It's really human nature. I mean, it's just we see it so often. And so this one especially made Nehemiah mad. And you don't even blame him. Now, he does this. I'm not sure quite if he was like supposed to do this, but he did do this because he got so mad he hit some of them and he pulled out their hair, making them swear by God that they would not do this again. Nehemiah was a pretty intense guy, and it sounds like he needed to be able to deal with some of this. And Nehemiah ends off by asking God to remember him for good. But yes, that has been the Genesis episode 2. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you guys next week.